Welcome to what might be the most controversial session we are having today. And to save our speakers sort of the initial mea culpa, let me just say that yes, we are talking about carbon removal, taking CO2 back out of thin air, and no, that is not the first line of defense. All right, so yes, solar PV and wind and energy efficiency and, but what then? And to discuss this question, I'm happy to welcome three distinguished speakers here today. I will save you the ceremonial reading of the bios now in the interest of time. But just to say, in introducing Nili Gilbert, who will give the first remarks, the most significant part of your bio, you were a graduate of this institution, 2003, and you're also the vice chairwoman of Carbon Direct. And you'll get us started with 6-8 minutes of where are we with carbon removal? How does it all fit into the big picture? Nili.
Well, thanks so much for having me. It's great to be back at Columbia and even better to be on the new campus. I got to turn this on. One sec. Hi, thanks so much for having me. I was just saying how great it is to be back at Columbia and even better to be here on the new campus. I thought I'd talk a little bit about my own background and what brought me to the climate solution space professionally. I actually started my career in the world of philanthropy. And that's what made me really think about the role that financial capital has to play in solving our global problems. I worked for a Rockefeller Family Foundation where I still chair the investment committee. I chair the investment committees of 2 of the family's funds and sit on a third, all of which have made net zero pledges. For 2 decades, I managed institutional capital in traditional strategies that integrate ESG. And in 2020, I started really thinking about, ESG integration is important as a start, but is that really going to be enough to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees, which is going to be a very tough goal. And so I stepped away from running my own firm in 2020, and I spent a whole year just focusing on philanthropy and working on net zero inside of the United Nations system, where today I chair the advisory panel of technical experts for the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, which is an alliance of over 450 firms, and actually over 500 now, that have all made net zero pledges across banking, insurance, asset owners, asset managers. And as the chair of the advisory panel of technical experts, I spent a lot of time poring over the net zero pathways, the pathways for carbon emissions and other greenhouse gas emissions that will get us to net zero, and came to understand that when you think about limiting global warming even significantly below 2 degrees, we're going to have to do certainly a significant amount of reductions, but we're never going to be able to reduce all of the emissions that we're putting in the atmosphere by 2050. And if you really start with the imperative of limiting human suffering, limiting planetary suffering, you start to ask yourself, what do I need to do? What do we need to do to achieve this goal? So for the Rockefeller family funds, when we made our net zero pledge, you may know many of the Rockefeller institutions had already divested from fossil fuels. And we took the temperature of our portfolios, which means if you imagine that your portfolio were the whole global economy, what temperature trajectory would we be on, right? So these These portfolios are completely ESG aligned, divested from fossil fuels, and we found that if those portfolios stayed on business as usual, doing what they're doing today, we would still be on track for more than 3 degrees of global warming. And so this really got me thinking about net zero in a new way. So also for the Rockefeller family funds, we talk a lot about double materiality. Like there are some investors who have made climate pledges because importantly, they want to protect their own portfolios from climate risk. But as our investment committees thought about it, we said, we don't think that we really can hedge climate risk out of just our portfolio alone. We think it's a fallacy. Because the truth is that all investment capital is driving climate risk, just as that risk is driving our returns. And so in order to break that feedback loop, we felt that we needed to get invested in climate solutions, figuring out what types of applications of capital could actually break the cycle of climate change. And so, after looking at all of this, this is what brought me to focus on Carbon Direct, where we're investing in climate solutions that are reducing, removing, utilizing, and storing carbon. I want to say a little bit about the carbon budget. So, as many of you know, the remaining carbon and carbon equivalent budget that we have before we achieve the limit that will allow us to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees is about 400 gigatons. And we're emitting about 55 a year right now. And so we only have less than a decade to continue on this pathway. On average across countries, but for high emitting countries like the US, that number is actually only 3 years. To the extent that we overshoot this number, we will have to remove even more carbon than we currently think that we will. And the number that we would need to remove if we achieve the 1.5 degree pathways is already 10 gigatons. And so what we need to do is figure out the right way to do both of the things that we know that we need to accomplish to limit global warming. Reduce as much as we can, and then focus on carbon removals. So at Carbon Direct, we're doing 2 things. We're advising numerous companies, many Fortune 500 companies, some municipalities now as well, on their own carbon management journeys, focusing on strategies, everything that they can do to reduce their emissions, but also creating high quality portfolios of carbon removals, starting from nature-based solutions all the way up into permanent, durable, and engineered removals. And then we're also making investments, growth equity investments, in the technologies that can be used to decarbonize heavy industry. This is carbon capture, utilization, storage, and future fuels like green hydrogen and sustainable aviation fuels. Some people who worry about carbon removal say that it's unproven or somehow speculative, and we really need to push back on that old narrative. Because in many cases, it's not true. At Carbon Direct, we're actually employing now almost 60 climate scientists in every field of carbon management. And it's not that they're sitting there inventing new technologies. The work now is just figuring out how to scale up the solutions that are working and to understand the relative costs of the different solutions compared to their carbon savings, something that we call the levelized cost of carbon abatement. And so when we're making growth equity investments in climate technologies to manage carbon, we're investing in companies that already have successful solutions. They're making sales. The sales are growing as companies are increasing their net zero pledges. Their orders are increasing. And so mostly they're using the capital to scale up SG&A, to deliver against the orders that exist, and for R&D used to understand how to drive that scaling. The last thing that I want to talk about is the policy environment. We only underwrite to backward-looking policy. So there's already supportive policy for managing carbon, different carbon pricing regimes around the country and around the world. But in order for these solutions to scale up to the level that we need to see globally, we need to see that the price on carbon continues to rise. Essentially, as we were discussing in the green room, essentially at the end of the day, what we need to see is that the cost to capture and store a ton of carbon is the same as the global price that's put on it. And that is, on a forward-looking basis, what we need. And so as we talk about what the private sector can do in achieving net zero and what investment capital can do in achieving net zero, so much, but we should never pretend that we can do this without the supportive arm of public policy as well. Thanks. I look forward to the discussion.
Cool. Thank you. And actually, maybe just to tie the price of carbon, right? When those of you who were here for Rich Lesser's initial discussion, very bottom left of his final slide was, and we assume 75 euros per ton of CO2 by 2030 globally, right? So that may actually not be all that ambitious, which is good. That, right, sort of the most sort of, innovative, optimistic path doesn't rely on a massive price per ton of CO2, but it is certainly true that, right, this interplay of policy and business ambition is key. But you said something very interesting. We need to push back to carbon removal being unproven, which I believe was your lead-in for me to Julie Gosalvez, who is joining us from Zurich, is that right? Switzerland, at least. Hi, yes. Julie. The floor is yours.
Great. Well, thanks so much. I'm not yet in person, but I'm really honored to be with such great panelists and audience today. So thanks very much for the opportunity. Maybe really building on very common theme, right, that you just brought up, Nili. I think just looking backwards to all the events that we had at Climeworks over the last 6 months, really build on what you said, right? The scale up and making sure that the carbon removal technology is proven on the field was the opening of our fall last year with the launch of Orca, our direct capture and storage plant in Iceland, which is a living installation of our modular climate technology for direct capture combined with storage, right? So really putting this combination, let's say, outside in the real world. In the meantime, also IPCC has confirmed repeatedly, right, the need for removal on top of drastic emission reduction, and seeing that formulated so clearly is really, the confirmation of what we've been saying from day one, right? There's no confusion that we live in an all world, but really in an end world, and we need to pursue all routes together. Most recently, they've also been providing some guidance on the sizing of this removal, and more specifically for direct air capture, confirming that, in the 6-10 gigaton range annually, and that's why we need to put ourselves to work without any delay, right? At Climeworks, I think we're realistic optimists in a way that this notion of scale up to I would say double-digit gigaton by 2050 is realistic if we have significant, fast and strong milestone to get there, and that's what we're really focusing on. We've also seen a continued mobilization of the private sector, which has been the first sector to support this need with more deals. So after BCG. After Microsoft a bit more than a year ago, we've closed with BCG, LGT, also a European bank, or some private equity firms based in Europe, Verdane or Zendesk in the US. So all these players are really fundamental, as you very well say, Nili, right? To encourage everyone to bring the supply to the market when we see such high demand. We've seen also the finance scene really mobilizing. We've announced the same day than the latest IPCC report, 650 million equity round for Climeworks. As we design and build and operate machines like the one you see behind, infrastructure would be the core of our development, along with further R&D research, in improving the technology more and more, and then building the organization. We don't have yet 50 climate scientists, Nili, but that's my dream. Or 60. So really inspired by what you're doing here. And then last but not least, really doubling down on what you said, right? We've seen the start of some solid policy focus and programs, mostly in the US. So that's really good to see. Or some granting program like the Innovation Fund. But that's really what we need to bring that to the next level. So we really also believe that what's going ahead is equally exciting. We see a continued traction from the private sector, and that's what we need. But the more the urgency and the need for action will be understood, and again that it's an and not a either or, the more we'll see a concrete step for the entire value chain, right? Direct Capital sits in a value chain that's very complete, from the renewable, in our case, renewable energy supply, as well as the storage capabilities. We're part of some pilots with the Department of Energy in the US and other locations in the world, but we can't do that alone, right? For DAC and for carbon removal. So it really requires all stakeholders to come together, and that's really something that we're working on. We had last year a summit in Zurich, putting together all actors focusing on expanding the market in September, and we also have one now in June this year, focusing on the scaling up. So that's really also what we're pushing to do as Climeworks, and progressing all together toward that goal. So that's our focus.
And of course, you are out in the field with a live shot of your plant sucking 4,000 tons of CO2.
Yes, the capture capacity is 4,000 tons per year. Yeah, that's correct. And it's really critical for us to be out in the field, right? I mean, our raw material that we work with is the air, right? So it's everywhere, but it's also subject to any kind of conditions, right? It rains, it snows, it has some specific gases inside due to specific conditions where you are. I mean, pollution is one, but also just naturally some gases are more present in concentration, definitely across the globe. So that's really from getting out of the lab, out of the prototype stage, and really running that, I would say, in a series production stage, and moving very surely towards the mass production. So our philosophy is really to put that in the field as fast as possible. There are debates whether 4,000 ton is too small or small, but it's really beyond the size that we're talking about. It's really significant because it's really out there, and that's what we need to focus on and learn from that, and have the dual ambition really to bring the capacity to the market. So it's really actually purchased from. And it gives companies this, first step of triggering a virtuous circle to do that, but also being really out in the field and fine tuning the technology, how it interacts with its environment, and that's providing invaluable learning for our roadmap. So the next step would be another roughly 10x scale up from that in a couple of years already. So fast, small, but really effective iteration is our philosophy, and that's the way also the technology has been designed, really very modular, so inspired from successful recent case studies in industry, solar, wind, electric batteries, and making sure that from the design the technology is scalable.
Sure. Can you maybe give us just a very quick sense of the economics, sort of both current and learning curve, looking forward, potential future, price per ton of CO2?
Yeah, Well, I mean, as I said, we're still in the very, early days and getting a sense of that with stable operation. So we're more looking at a range. So we're in, I would say, high hundreds, 800s, something. So that's looking at that range is more or less a good benchmark. And I think what Rich Lesser said earlier is more or less what everyone agrees on as a production. $100, something is probably a viable threshold to agree on. So some say 100 to 200 by then, and we feel optimistic and confident that's where we will be, probably always at the highest end of the range. Also looking at the basically the quality and the permanence mostly of the product that we deliver, given that we focus on underground mineralization. So we're talking about 1,000 years plus storage quality. And also full measurability and additionality, right? We know, being tech, we know how much carbon we capture, how much carbon we store, and that's purely incremental, right? No carbon would be stored and captured if the installation wouldn't be there. So these notions and concept of additionality, measurability, and permanence really give a really high quality product. And we're beyond competition between solutions here, because we've said it many times, but it's really important to understand that all solutions have benefits and all solutions are needed, unfortunately, with the scale of the challenge we have at hand. But just to say that because of these points, right, we will probably always operate at the higher end of the range, so closer to the 100 than to the 70. But if we look at that number as a proxy, that's where we totally see the technology at the gigaton scale.
Let me bring Ryan Orbuch into this conversation. So you're a partner at Lowercarbon Capital, just raised $350 million for a carbon removal fund. How does that fit into, how is that part of the solution where you say, look, we've got to get to scale? How does Climeworks technology fit into it? And sort of what are you looking at as the full range of technologies, price points? What's your business model?
Yeah, thank you, Gernot. It's great to be here and see everybody. And I guess to start off, if anyone finds himself in Reykjavik and Julie is kind enough to show them around, it's really worth going to visit the Climeworks facility. It's like quite emotional to see. It's both very big and very small. It's really cool. All that being said, so yeah, I'm Ryan. I'm a partner at Lowercarbon. We have a core decarbonization broad-based fund of 800 million that invests across emissions reduction and buying more time to help adapt and mitigate the risk of climate change. And now we have this new carbon removal fund that's dedicated specifically to investing in early stage companies that are likely to come up with pathways that can do gigaton scale, very high permanence, low cost carbon removal out for the next few decades. So to your question, I think we've seen a tremendous inflection in the market for pure carbon removal over the last few years and frankly over the last few weeks. And it's been really incredible to see the market signals start to become obvious enough that like you can only be on the phone with, say, a given scientist for like 10 minutes before they'll believe you that there's a market for carbon removal instead of like an hour, which is like what it was last summer. So I think that like the lack of confident enough market signal and the lack of examples of things working, frankly, have made it really difficult or significantly slowed the potential for new founders to come in and start carbon removal companies. And like now's kind of the time for that. I think that things like the Climeworks installation, things like Charm Industrial's delivery of permanent carbon removal and otherwise, like I was at a carbon removal research conference a couple weeks ago. And Julie, I don't know if you know this actually, but they put up Jan and Christoph, the Climeworks co-founders' thesis as the first slide of the first talk of a science conference. The audience was mostly academics. And it was the first slide, and the presenter was basically like, if they could do this as like 2 PhD students in Switzerland, like, in like 8 years or whatever it was, like anyone in this room can like do this too. And only now do we have those examples that we can start pointing to. And like this is true in tech, right? But it's now starting to become true in climate and carbon removal. So I'm just really excited about all the things that get started over the next few years. I think we're actually going to start figuring out how to do this.
Which goes back to you, Nili, right? This is not, right? We don't have to prove it exists. We don't have to prove it works. It's about scale, making it economic. What are sort of the most important bits to put this puzzle together?
The IPCC report that just came out, that Julie mentioned, came out at the beginning of this month, I think was significant in changing the conversation. You're all familiar, I'm sure, with the IPCC reports. The one that just came out was a report on mitigation that talks about what we're all talking about, which is what are we going to do about this existential problem. And years ago, around the time of Paris, the IPCC and the UN system, the climate scientists who produced their reports were cautious about their discussion on carbon removals because years ago, the technologies were still being developed. We didn't have Climeworks. We didn't have companies operating in the way that we do today. In the most recent report, though, the IPCC added to its conclusions not only the need for nature-based carbon removal, but underscored the need for permanent, durable carbon removal and storage of the type that Climeworks and others are doing. And so when I think about pathways to net zero, there's two different kinds of pathways at least that we need to think about. Some are the technical pathways, the scientific pathways, and some are the human pathways and the leadership pathways. And what's changing right now that Ryan, I think you also spoke very eloquently about, is the conversations that leaders are having about the viability, urgency, and the now of these solutions. And so the IPCC changed its report and said that this is necessary. Huge announcements are coming out. Hundreds of millions of billions of dollars of announcements are being announced right now for these investments. And when you think about it, the scale that we have ahead as this conversation change and the leadership momentum changes is very exciting, should not only be exciting to us as humans living on this planet, but should also be exciting to us as business people. When you think about the scale that we have ahead of us in terms of carbon to be removed, we are just at the very early innings. When you want to just try to put things in relative scales, because talking about all these gigatons and it's kind of feels still conceptual, the amount of carbon that we have to remove and store each year once we reach 2050 is 2 times the amount of fossil fuels that we're moving around the world today. And so the opportunity is huge. The science has been underwritten and accepted on a broad scale, and the markets are now moving. The money is now moving, and there's a great opportunity now to get involved, not only as leaders, but as business people moving forward.
I think maybe one thing I would add is just the rate that some of this stuff is inflecting is kind of crazy. I mean, to Nili's point earlier on, many of these solutions are already proven and need to be scaled up. That's certainly true, especially across decarbonization. I think it is the case in some areas of carbon removal, though, that previously I was at Stripe leading carbon removal purchasing. And one of the things that we saw over a number of rounds of applications and procurements was there were many ideas that companies were applying with that were not ideas that were in the IPCC report or in the National Academy's report table or any of the typical canonical resources for what carbon removal pathways are. I think those are a fraction, maybe the majority, maybe not, of the actual good ideas here. And there are going to be, and we're already seeing some examples of totally net new geophysical pathways that are not modeled, that in some cases there isn't a lot of literature around, but that people are starting to look at and think about because only now are people actually trying to poke the Earth system correctly to remove carbon, right? And before, a lot of the research in carbon removal was kind of an offshoot of flue stack capture or industrial decarbonization. And obviously all those things are important and many of them are further developed technologically and need to continue sort of scaling up and being deployed. But there's a lot of ideas that haven't been had yet here, which I think makes it a particularly fun time to consider working in this space. But I think it also means that there's going to be new things coming from non-academic settings. And then we're gonna have a really interesting process of like figuring out what of those are legit and which can become academically accepted or publicly accepted and otherwise. The next few years are gonna be really interesting for that reason.
The technical underwriting still matters.
Totally.
For this reason. That's why I'm so excited to work with so many climate scientists. To give you an idea, the number of companies in the carbon management space now is well over 1,000. We, in our due diligence, are investing in about 5% of the companies that we get seriously under the hood of. So, for us, if we have a lot of inbound from companies who are doing good work. The scientists can kind of push a lot of them to the side without doing heavy work. Even of the ones where we do the deep diligence, by the time you get through the technical and scientific underwriting and then lay that next to the traditional growth equity investment diligence, the funnel does narrow, and it's important to underscore that, right, especially as a fiduciary, but the opportunities are definitely out there and the field is growing.
You guys have done a great job bringing in different scientific expertise. It's cool to see the range.
Thanks, it's a lot of fun.
Yeah, it is a lot of fun.
So maybe let me give Julia a chance to chime in if you want to, and then open it up to questions here in the audience.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
I think building, I really strongly second what you just said, Nili, and just to bounce on it, is I think it's really important that while we kind of, we welcome and push for quantity, we'll still, make sure that we can hold to the highest level of scrutiny, because as we have no time to lose, we really need to focus on the solution that the highest, quality and higher scalability for that. And, there is a phase of seeding, definitely as many solutions as possible. And, Ryan, when you were at Stripe, you were already pioneering that big time. And, Stripe has also announced recently the Frontier Fund. So there are a lot of initiatives and they are really, really needed. But as we move to, life stages of those projects, it's really important to have this focus on the high quality. One of the things that we've been pushing to do is LCA analysis, for instance, that we've published, I would say a bit less than a year ago, maybe 9 months ago, on Orca, to really talk about the net effectiveness of the solution. We've already engaged into a certification process, really pioneering this because, of course, there's no process design industrially for direct capture and storage. So we have had the first step of a verification and next step of validation, and so we live up to the high standard that we believe we need to push for everyone, and that we encourage that. But I think that's really really a strong point to make sure that stays on the radar moving forward, and appreciating what you both just said. So.
Questions? Actually, maybe right there. Go ahead.
Good morning. I'm sure given I'm curious if how maybe aligning incentives.
Decentralized, do you mean you're talking about individual investors as opposed to institutional?
Right, precisely. So we're living in a time where there's just a lot of hullabaloo around NFTs.
I would say briefly, there's some interesting work being done there for sure. I'm worried that many of the sort of crypto offset shaped projects seem to interpret the carbon credit system as like the problem is liquidity and transferability, as opposed to the fact that the actual problem is that the underlying credits are mostly extremely low quality or like not legitimate. So like adding a layer of easier liquidity and transactability and like quote unquote transparency on top of that, I'm not sure if it helps very much. And like, I'm worried that it ends up entrenching credits that aren't that good anyways. I think that's not to say that like all of the work in that space isn't productive. I think like eventually we'll come up with something really interesting there, but I've been a little skeptical of what has been out there so far.
Go ahead here.
I have a question for you. So I recently read the of Climeworks, and we're not reaching 100% efficiency based on the energy mix. So do you see that as a challenge? Do you see that as a challenge to scale up direct air capture because of the energy mix?
And sorry,
If the
Julie, that
question
was,
intended for me.
it
Yeah,
was.
can
I don't
take
think you heard the
beginning of
first part, but
So yes, I read your LCA study on the direct air capture, and the energy, carbon capture efficiency is not 100% because of the global energy mix. So do you see that as a challenge to scale up the direct air capture technology?
I mean, it's 90%, right?
Right.
90%. So I think we need to differentiate. The way the LCA was built is on the full life cycle, so not on the operation, right? I think that's very important to state that. So meaning building the plant, including components that are, as you can see behind me, even if it's a different technology generation, still have some industrial pieces made of steel, for instance. We've worked on reducing the amount of steel, but there are still some, right? Then building the plant, operating the plant, obviously, and then potentially dismantling the plant. So like a full life cycle. And across this entire cycle, the net effectiveness is 90%. But when you think about the operation of it, we at a higher level, right? The decrease in the mix comes from other phases. So we feel at that stage, that 90% is really a great number to go on and continue to scale. Of course, just like the cost, energy requirement and process improvement is really a big focus of what we do, and what we are targeting at doing by the scale up steps. So that's a strong base to start with.
cool. We have another question down here. Go ahead.
Hi, Corbin Heyer from E&E News. Gernot, you said at the beginning that you need to make emissions reductions first, and then we can talk about carbon removal. But I think it's also important to note that some of the biggest investors in the space, Oxy and Carbon Engineering, you've got Exxon backing Global Thermostat. So how do you folks think about the role of the oil industry in backing carbon removal?
I mean, I can kick off with this. I think that it's probably really important to separate out two issues, right? Like who has some incentive about their organization or their business such that carbon removal may allow them to emit longer, which I think like is often assumed about some of these players. In some cases it's true, although it's pretty rare that it's actually the case. I do think that separately from that, right, there is the who actually has the physical expertise to move large quantities of fluid in and out of the ground. And like, although this is in some senses, like ethically kind of unfortunate, like it is the case that oil companies know how to do that, right? And there isn't another industry waiting in the wings that can move huge amounts of fluid in and out of the ground and has years of experience of that. And I think that's something that like the field is gonna need to reconcile a little bit, right? Like it's not a perfect answer. I do think that decarbonization is proceeding mostly independently, as far as I could tell, of carbon removal. And I think that in the vast majority of cases, accelerated work on carbon removal is still, fractions of percentage of funding that's going into emissions reduction. And I have seen like very little genuinely suggest that the progress in carbon removal is hurting emissions reduction. And obviously emissions reduction is the massive priority and is being treated that way by the finance community for the most part.
We need to be very clear about the role of traditional oil and gas players in the net zero transition overall. Just as every sector has its own transition plan and role to play, so does the oil and gas sector. And I agree with Ryan that the expertise in carbon capture and storage is critical. I value the critical voices, critical now used in a different sense, of activists who are purists on oil and gas as kind of like goading the conversation along and holding us to high standards. But at the end of the day, realistically, what we're gonna need to do is really figure out the transition plan for oil and gas, and this is one of the important roles that it will have to play.
Julia, you want to chime in here? Otherwise, we'll go to the very back for one more question. Go ahead. Oh, sorry, Julie.
Let's go to, no, that's okay. Let's go to the last question.
Okay, good. Sorry, go ahead.
Great
Okay,
answers.
hi.
No worries.
I'm Josh from the Sustainability Management Program. So my question is, I've been looking at Climeworks for quite some time now. I'm one of the pioneers of Climeworks. And so my question is, how do you guys see the development in the customer front? Primarily because I feel like the reliance is on like public policy, tax incentives is so much. And I was wondering what the moves were to break away from that heavy reliance on and developing just that market base in carbon removal. Because if I may be wrong, but I don't think it's part of the emission trading system yet, or cap and trade, carbon removal credits. I'm not really sure if it is part right now, but yeah, I just wanted to know what your thoughts are in like developing that customer base for direct air capture.
Okay, Julie?
Yes, sure. Well, thanks first. Massive thank you to be a pioneer, for being a pioneer. We're really delighted to have such a strong community. I think to paraphrase what Ryan was saying earlier, there are two kind of topics, right? For the scale and the magnitude of where we need to go as an industry and where the challenge at hand for humanity, there's no doubt that this will not be done without compliance markets and policy support for the market size, but also for the infrastructure that go with it from a supply chain standpoint, right? Now, in the meantime, there still need to be some fundamental steps taken in terms of technology development, proof of concept, and beginning of industrialization, right? Which is where we are at. And in that sense, today, this wouldn't be possible without the support of individuals. Today, Climeworks has over 13,000 pioneers, nearly 14,000 pioneers as individuals, but the corporation, right? The corporation really create this virtuous circle between supply and demand, but also give enough confidence about the significant projected size of the market, right? When we go to debt financing for infrastructure program, but also equity finance or fund, like Ryan is leading. So that's really important. So I really see them as complementary. One has a huge leverage and size. When this becomes carbon removal becomes kind of both mandatory and possible at gigaton scale, it's really different magnitude than what we're offering today, but without where we are today, there's no tomorrow. So it's really these two faces of the same coin in a sense.
Cool. Thank you. Thank you, everyone, and thanks for a terrific conversation.
Thank you.